Thank you, Susan, for the introduction. I cannot speak today without acknowledging that I should not be the one up here. Speaking on this sacred holiday to honor the legacy of Dr. King, I believe should be reserved for the paid labor of Black women. What I am knowingly participating in today is something called centering whiteness. It's something that white folk do all the time, often well-meaning, when participating in racial justice work. Hesitantly, I said yes to this opportunity because I believe this is the most important conversation we need to be having. We, meaning people born into white bodies. First, I do not believe I am an expert in any of this. I am only here to share what I have tried to embody over the last few years. I will most likely make a mistake. Also, I make no assumption about where any of you are in your journey of coming to terms with your own white privilege and what that entails. Speaking on this topic should be direct and not designed to maintain comfort. I hope today is more than simply thought-provoking, but emotionally activating. The work that is required to divest from whiteness or rid ourselves of the harmful traits of white supremacy does not hold space for intellectual debate. It is an embodiment practice, and therefore the work will never be complete. You may find yourself feeling defensive and grasping at ways to prove that you are not included in the group I'm addressing today. I know this because I've done it. I've tried to come up with excuses to prove that I was one of the good white people, that I was anti-racist, that there were aspects of my life that disqualified me from the group of people that were causing harm. I pointed fingers outside of myself because the thought that I, wife to a Mexican man and mother of 3 biracial children, could possibly be part of the problem. I was not yet open to seeing it. After being called out and called in on several occasions, I thankfully became open to the probability. I then got quiet and started to dig deeper into my own internalized racism and what whiteness meant. So knowing what I know now, I can guarantee that if you were born into a white body, you are also part of this group and part of the problem. The sooner you settle in and open your heart and mind, the sooner the work begins. And this work is crucial if we want a more just world. I was originally asked to speak today about my experience with racism and colorism because of my children. But the truth is, I have never experienced racism. I have only observed it secondhand, which does not qualify me in any way to speak to it. I am among the group that benefits most from the current system, and my children will have an experience different from mine because of their marginalized identities that I can never fully understand. But unlike other white mothers, I do not have the luxury of shielding my children from anything I think is too hard for them to understand. The things I have to worry about protecting them from are not only a normal toxic function of society, but also within me as a product of that society. I am tasked with unlearning an entirely whitewashed upbringing like many of us, so that I don't center my whiteness as the norm in their lived experience. It's the responsibility of all white folk to do the work of divesting from whiteness as a means to truly bridge the disparity gap and fight racism. We must each become radically aware of our participation in upholding the system. All of the concepts I address today have come from the emotional labor done by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I am a student unlearning what I was taught because of their hard work. I will cite my sources where I am able, but I'm also human and may not remember where I got a concept. I never expected to be sharing any of this information in a public space. So to combat not being able to diligently give credit where credit is due, I will later be emailing a directory of resources that I have found powerful, and I urge you all to take the time to dig into them. So before we begin to divest from whiteness, we have to understand what it is. It is much more than skin tone. It is a culture defined by a set of behaviors that uphold white supremacy in our world. And those behaviors are the foundation of which all systems of society were built, specifically designed to benefit white folk. Savala Nola, the executive director of the Center for Social Justice at UC Berkeley School of Law, often asks white students this question: how do you know you are white? If she asks, how do you know you are Black, to a Black student, she may hear, because society tells me every day, or to a Latina student, because of my culture. But white students often can't answer. White folk walk around every day not having to acknowledge their whiteness, so they've never been confronted with thinking about what it means. Have you ever realized that the media refers to a group of white kids as kids, but a group of Black kids as Black kids or African American? Deanna Hayes Green of the Racial Equity Institute explains it in these terms: that which is marked is other, and that which is unmarked is normal. She proves her point further by talking about how historically Black churches are celebrated as historically Black, and historically white churches. Thing is, you cannot have historically Black churches without whiteness as the comparison. Whiteness is running the show from behind the scenes, always as the default normal used to establish otherism. Whiteness isn't undefinable, though. It is just hard to see when you're white because the system was designed that way. It's just how things are to white folk until it is pointed out to us by someone outside of whiteness. In reading excerpts of an article called White Supremacy Culture by Tema Okun, which outlines the characteristics of whiteness, I personally was finally able to put words to some of the feelings I had about my own whiteness. I can now look back at moments where I unknowingly was becoming aware and also was blind to what my whiteness meant. Some of the characteristics of white supremacy culture are power hoarding, either or thinking, defensiveness, thinking there is only one right way, right to comfort, and more I will address later. Being able to see how I exhibited these characteristics in the past has provided a necessary perspective that I can learn from moving forward. Many of you know at least a small piece of my family's story. My husband was deported back in 2017, which is what led us here to San Miguel. The part of the story that has kept me up at night for years was, why did we intentionally walk into that courtroom? I always felt responsible, and it turns out I am. We knew being arrested was a possibility, but why did I feel like it was unlikely? I can now see that the answer was my whiteness. My whiteness thought that the system worked the same for everyone. I thought if we did the quote unquote right thing and followed the law, all would turn out okay. Within days, I saw the reality and lost faith in the system. Nothing happened the way it should according to the law. I became aware of white privilege, and as we gathered letters as proof of character to try to desperately keep my husband in the US, I knew that letters from white professionals held more value. After we found out he couldn't stay, I thought if I wrote a letter to the judge, pleading as a mother to give him time served so we could go on about our lives and move to Mexico, maybe he would take pity. And it crossed my mind that my whiteness would help. The judge not only gave time served, but went out of his way to commend me for my choice in moving to Mexico. He said, and I quote, "It's not every day that you see a woman willing to give up her own country for the sake of unity." Recently, I asked Jesus what he thought the judge really meant by that. because I can think of hundreds of women who make the same decision every day for their families. Jesus helped me realize what he really meant is it's not every day a white woman would be willing to give up her comfort to move outside of what he probably thought was the greatest country in the world, because he's a conservative white man in Arizona. I was correct in thinking that he would take pity, and he saw my humanity. And most definitely, he saw it because I'm white. That is the world we live in. I used my whiteness to our advantage, and it worked. Reviewing this story again, it hit me how much power my whiteness holds. And with power, there is potential to cause harm. So it may at first glance look like I used my whiteness for good. But intertwined, there were two characteristics of white supremacy culture that played a huge role in my decision-making back then. One, thinking that there was only one right way, and my right to comfort. I could pat myself in the back for being a good white person, but mostly I just cringe looking back at all the times I dismissed my husband's feelings because of my white right to comfort when it came to his case and his legal status. And I dismissed my mother-in-law's feelings too. In my mind, following the law as I understood it in my white perspective was the only right way. My whiteness did not save my husband, but it did make things a lot easier for us. I have to acknowledge that. I also have to acknowledge that my whiteness is what made me blind to walking into a traumatic situation thinking that everything would be fine. That is a heartache my family has to live with forever. As hard as it is to look at that time through this new lens, it has given me the gift of being able to make changes to better the lives of my children moving forward. All of us exhibit these behaviors in some way, shape, or form. It's our culture. The good news is, since it's cultural, we have the power to break free of it. Just like many of you have adapted to new ways of living and culture in Mexico, you can always leave this old toxic culture behind. This will allow us one day at a time to move from being white people who uphold white supremacy to people who happen to be white. So how do we start divesting or ridding ourselves of whiteness? Okun's article is a remarkable starting place. From my own experience, the most important places to start is grappling with defensiveness and right to comfort. Defensiveness often shows up in conflict when our white right to comfort is threatened, intertwining these two characteristics. When a concept or idea threatens our good view of ourselves, our brains immediately jump to holding on to who we think we are, especially when it comes to confronting our whiteness. We find comfort in our goodness. If we were to let go of the idea of being good, that means confronting how fragile our humanity actually is and our inevitability to make mistakes. This may first start as an internal dialogue that could sound like, well, that doesn't apply to me because of XYZ reason. But this defensiveness can eventually lead to conversations where you just have to play devil's advocate. Not surprisingly, or at least for me, objectivity is a tenet of white supremacy culture. This does not necessarily show up only in conversations about race. This is often simply how we have learned to operate because it's what was modeled and the way we were actively taught. So of course we apply it to conversations about race. Confronting our whiteness also means confronting our internalized racism, which does not stay true to upholding our good view of ourselves or the cultural norms of white right to comfort and perfectionism. These ideals hold us to impossible standards that leave no room for human error. We want to think of ourselves of anti-racist as a finished product, when really we might always have internalized racism. We must be aware of that in order to fight it, because we can't address something we are denying is there. Excuse me, sorry. So the simple fix to all of this: accept our inherent humanity. Learn to be uncomfortable without jumping to defend ourselves. Stopping to ask ourselves questions like, why am I feeling uncomfortable? Or what is this discomfort trying to tell me? Things that I have come to realize when asking myself these questions is, I don't like being wrong. I don't like being told no, and I especially don't like feeling guilty. All of these are an avoidance of discomfort. Confronting our avoidance of discomfort, I believe, is the key to divesting from whiteness. So where does this need to avoid discomfort come from? My answer, it's a trauma response. We can put our finger on the trauma caused by blatant displays of racism caused by white supremacy culture, but the trauma within white supremacy is much more subtle, and it affects everyone, not just white folk. The trauma caused is disconnection from our emotions, essentially ourselves, which prevents us from connecting deeply with others. An inability to sit with our uncomfortable humanness. At the beginning of the pandemic, and when racial tensions were at their height after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, I was making some pretty big mistakes as a white person. In April 2020, I had just become a certified life coach because I was honestly grasping at straws to better myself. I had started processing my own trauma, and I was living in a shame cycle of trying to fix myself and working diligently to be a quote unquote good person. How I first attempted to prove my goodness was to be verbal about my outrage at the murders of Black people at the hands of police and screaming my support of the Black Lives Matter movement. A good friend of mine called me out for centering my own rage, which was centering whiteness, which actually does nothing to support racial justice. It's just a distraction and a way for white folk to feel better about themselves. At first, I felt defensive naturally, but with applying all I had just learned in my coaching training about the function of the nervous system, stress responses, and trauma, I got curious and I made a crucial connection. In the book, The Body Keeps the Score, the author, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, defines trauma as an experience that overwhelms our capacity to cope. Anytime we experience a trauma, it wires the way our nervous systems respond to stress in the future. Then factor in our brain's primary function of protection, and it's a recipe for fighting against any discomfort. I realized I hadn't yet learned to cope with such a devastation, so I was attempting to escape it, and in a harmful way. If you look at white supremacy culture through a trauma-informed lens, all of its behaviors can be seen as protection strategies, protection from overwhelming our system's capacity to cope. White supremacy culture is centered around avoidance. Perfectionism allows no rooms for mistake. Objectivity requires us to separate from ourselves, from our feelings, to be objective. Individualism requires disregarding the feelings of others, which you can't do without ignoring or shutting down your own, which most likely shows up as defensiveness. I believe that these ways of living are unnecessary survival strategies passed down for generations. The disconnect from humanity was necessary for our white ancestors to commit horrific acts. This makes white supremacy culture the most devastating generational trauma of the world. Trauma cycles do not stop haphazardly. They must intentionally be broken. They may lessen over the course of generations or adapt to fit the social norms of the time. These protective mechanisms will still be there until someone breaks it within themselves and then teaches a new way to the next generation. White supremacy culture is no different. We are not going to just wake up one day and all of a sudden these trauma response behaviors are gone. We have to make a choice to do something different. These behaviors are embedded in the way we think, in our neural pathways, in our nervous system responses to threat. We have to rewire each of these systems individually within ourselves. Over the past year, I have studied and practiced how to rewire my brain and reset my nervous system. The hardest realization is that it requires immense discomfort. The more I learn to sit in discomfort and work with rewriting the stories that anchor me to my need to be viewed as good and likable, I have found myself able to slowly let go of characteristics of white supremacy. I am less defensive and no longer addicted to maintaining comfort. I also have found myself learning to let go of perfectionism, urgency, and either-or thinking. I'm not always perfect. It's a process and a consistent practice. There are two emotions that have surfaced most frequently that are especially uncomfortable: shame and grief. And I truly believe that rumbling with grief and shame, rumbling being a word Brené Brown uses to describe processing hard emotions, is not only the answer to divesting from whiteness, but also healing systematic oppression on a global scale. When we diffuse the power of shame by letting go of our need to be perceived as good and grieve the loss of who we think we are, we begin to operate from a different place. We live from our humanness and vulnerability. This is never easy. It is never easy to sit in the shame of feeling like a terrible person. I have learned through my trauma work that shame is a protection for the grief. This resonates so closely with a piece of attachment theory that I learned about trauma. This theory explains that when we are children, we don't get what we need from our caregivers, we often blame ourselves. This is actually a much more hopeful position to take, because if we, the individual, is the problem, then maybe we can fix it. It helps us protect ourselves from having to acknowledge and grieve the failings of our caregivers. This is also true when we are confronted with the failures of society. Defensiveness protects our shame and avoidance of discomfort, and shame protects the grief that is necessary to confront that society as a whole is an oppressive system that has indoctrinated us all, just like our families of origin. Individualism and blaming ourselves like that we are the problem is one of the main characteristics of white supremacy culture. Individualism says we must protect ourselves and our perceived goodness at all costs. And I am posing that individualism is trauma in action. It says we are alone in our pain because maybe we were left alone to process when we were little. We are alone in feeling uncomfortable, and it keeps us stuck in the shame around harm we may have caused in the past or the potential harm we have to cause in the future as white folk. When we stay there in the shame, we then take action from a place of trying to make up for our shortcomings, which is continuing to center ourselves, our comfort, and our whiteness. The point of all of this is to learn to take action, not as a means of self-preservation and maintaining goodness, but as a means to meet the needs of the global community. We cannot meet these needs if we don't first learn how to listen to what they are. and we can't hear them over the sound of our own white guilt and shame. I think one of the biggest mistakes I made was jumping into activism too early after becoming aware of my privilege. I hadn't yet confronted the shame which kept me from truly listening to what my husband needed at the time. Truth is, I felt guilty for being white, and I wanted to make a difference, and it needed to happen now. No time to waste. And sense of urgency at its core, and yet another way to avoid discomfort. It wasn't until I got quiet and I truly started to listen to what I needed to do to make the most impact. And often it wasn't take action, it was just to listen. Living in shame is what white supremacy wants in order to maintain individualism. It keeps us all separate. All tenets of white supremacy depend on each other to survive. Take down one and you are a threat to them all. So I pose that learning to process our shame is the most radical thing we can do to fight against oppression. And processing shame in community, I believe, is even more radical. We then can collectively grieve the failings of our society and divest from our own whiteness as a means to heal this collective trauma and within ourselves and the world. At the end of the day, the privilege that comes with being born into a white body will always give us choice in whether we do this work. And something I've had to realize is not everyone is willing. Until enough white folk let go of our attachment to comfort and other characteristics of white supremacy, I honestly don't believe anything will change. The scariest part for me living in our current world is knowing that the opposite of love and caring for the global community is not hate or blatant acts of racism, it's apathy. And no one comes across as more apathetic than a white person who thinks that their work is already done. This work will only be done when we live in a world where people born into white bodies no longer hold on so tightly to comfort and power. I'd like to end with a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King, which has often been lost in whitewashed history. It is just as true today as it was when King spoke it. Whites, it must frankly be said, are not putting in a similar mass effort to re-educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. It is an aspect of their sense of superiority that the white people of America believe they have so little to learn. Thank you.